False paths in spirituality operate within the paradigm of duality, in belief in being a thing relating to other things, be either of them subtle or gross, meaning that some people believe themselves to be a physical thing relating to physical things exclusively, and some people believe themselves to be truly a subtle thing relating to other subtle or gross things, and others believe themselves to be some combination thereof. There are many dualistic spiritual traditions that describe mutually exclusive realities, which is a talking point of materialists against entity worshippers. That these things can't all be true that they are saying. To the extent that it's possible to mistake a dream for reality, there can be no trusting of what appears in awareness. Just as there is no fixed position in the universe, there's no way to discern the true north of what appears in awareness. Like, I can be fairly certain that I'm awake and speaking into a microphone, but I have, in fact, experienced the belief in being awake while asleep. And so it's possible for the mind to conjure anything that can be imagined, and there be no way to discern whether it's true in that moment, only in hindsight perhaps. Thus, the testimony of anyone claiming supernatural revelation cannot be validated and therefore not trusted. When you watch YouTube, you can see all kinds of contradicting stories about spiritual experiences claiming to have encounters with angels or Jesus or other gods telling them things, but they have no way of knowing whether they are delusional, and nor do we. For this reason, belief in dualistic spiritual systems is a matter of faith. It's a matter of faith for those who have never seen but believe, and a matter of faith for those who have seen but trust the reality of what was projected into their awareness. That second kind of faith is not often a conscious one, but rather more like the kind that Wile E. Coyote has when he runs off the cliff and stays in the air until he sees his true circumstance. What I mean is that people tend to believe what they perceive and don't question. This negation of entity worship by virtue of the subjective nature of experience is not sufficient to vindicate the materialist view, as even the mundane experience we call reality can be false. It's easy to call the spectacular false, but it requires insight to believe the mundane to be so. The spirituality that actually leads to the prize to which dualism wrongly points in the form of some heaven realm or reward from some entity is neither materialist nor entity worshipping, but rather truth-seeking. And there is by definition no truth to be found in the changeful, as the truth is unchanging. Therefore, the only truth to be perceived is in the unmoving space in which everything appears. If you look at any spiritual tradition, be it dualistic or non-dualistic, you'll find examples of scandalized individuals. If you rule out physiological problems that create behavioral problems, such as schizophrenia, the outrageous acts perpetrated by otherwise sane people are the product of obsessive thinking. It is really that simple, but I think we want to overcomplicate it. Like we call people evil, but in the reality, they are just unconscious. The seeds of what makes for these evil deeds exists within every unconscious person. Everyone operating in duality is subject to the delusions from which arise horrific human actions. It's just the happenstance of which thoughts are there to push buttons. But as long as there's belief in being one to relate to thoughts and things, there's the possibility of thoughts to push buttons. And then it's just a question of exposure. Like, to what have we been exposed to create those thoughts that push those particular buttons? As long as there's operating within the belief of being that subject relating to thoughts and objects, there's that potential for reacting. So when we criticize somebody for being evil, the reasons for their evilness are within us. We just haven't been exposed to the same things to which they've been exposed. I mean, I guess it's the old, he came from a bad home. But apart from that, like, if you look at the randomness of bad actors, again, and I'm not talking about the people you would expect to be bad actors because they have a history of impulsiveness and a bad upbringing. I'm talking about people who nobody would believe they would have done the thing they did. The actions that come from those types of people are from obsessive thinking. And that type of acting out from one's obsessive thoughts can occur only from the position of believing oneself to be a thing relating to other things, because in the absence of that belief, thoughts can't get the traction on the emotions for the purposes of creating desire, and thus a suffering that motivates a seeking for relief through activities, be they wholesome or unwholesome. Like these people who are in positions of trust, they will confess to having some kind of obsessive thought life, typically. The suffering that comes from this belief, it's a state that overlays our natural state. Our natural state is, though we don't realize it, unconditional peace and love. It's not known in duality, apart from the conditions that align circumstance with the mind's ideal. But even that's just temporary. But when the unconscious belief in being the subject of thought and circumstance ceases, there's a stillness by virtue of that lack of belief in being anything to which anything can relate. In that stillness appears our natural state. It's like in unconsciousness, it's like we're being visited by thoughts. And like if a stranger shows up at your door and they're telling you some kind of crazy false story, you're probably not going to let them in, right? But when, you know, a relative shows up, you just let them in. And that's how it is with the house of our being and obsessive thinking that leads to suffering and bad acting. It's like let's say you have somebody show up at your door and like they're these like a family, and it's like the Griswolds showing up at that random German family's house, you know, thinking they've arrived at their distant relatives but got the door number wrong. And so like they just wander into these people's houses presuming to know them and acting like they belong there, and the people are just too awkward to say anything about it. And so this whole charade goes on, and they part ways, and the homeowners are like, who are they? I have no idea. In unconsciousness, we're treating every thought that shows up as a relative somehow because we believe ourselves to be a thing related to them, and then we let them in our house. And you know, whether or not there's problems in that house kind of depends on those thoughts, the exposure to which, you know, is kind of a product of random circumstance. So in a person like, you know, like Ted Bundy or the BTK, the thoughts they've let into their house are highly problematic. But in other people who are well behaved, the thoughts behave well, and so they are normal. But they're both subject to acting on ideas, which really can be anything, right? There's no limiting factor on what can be imagined, really. So I guess there's a few ways it can go for a being in spiritual terms, in terms of the seeking of truth, right? So there's the materialist path, which still subjects one to the thoughts that precipitate, you know, unconscious actions. Like I think Jeffrey Dahmer, in his serial killing days, was just kind of a materialist. I think he may have found religion at some point, but you know, people who do horrible things, they don't have to be religious, right? They can be materialists. They just have an obsession around some material circumstance that they want to bring forth, right? So that is a response to suffering that is just a doubling down on the material, right? There's not a seeking of relief through some kind of religiosity, okay? And then there can be people who are dualistic but entity worshippers, effectively materialists who believe in some entity apart from the reality that's being experienced, who will somehow intervene at some point with either a reward or punishment. And again, to the extent that they are subject to the belief in being something relating to other things, thoughts can just push buttons in them willy-nilly. And so they also can be like the BTK, who was, you know, a deacon at his church, okay? But the seeking of truth, as in the seeking of what doesn't change, and not through experiences with entities, that is more often embarked upon, that seeking is more often successfully embarked upon through a less than perfect life, right? Like if the Griswolds who show up in your house, you know, these random thoughts that fill the space, don't cause big problems, there's no impetus to expose them as imposters, or there's no impetus to seek the truth that eventually exposes them as imposters. But if the Griswolds are all big troublemakers and cause suffering, then there is. And so then it's a question of whether or not there'll be a pursuit of truth through entity worship, through doubling down in materialism, or through discovering the nature of reality, like the non-self nature of what appears in awareness by virtue of its inability to be what's aware of it. Like nothing in awareness can be what's aware of it. And in discovering that, that can lead to a disconnecting of the power of thought to move the emotions, and that can generate this stillness. It's the end of obsessive thinking and the beginning of a contentment that precludes the type of neediness that precipitates unconscious action. That's all for now.